Eddie Adams here to teach you how to make a Freckles and Rosy Cheeks effect in Effect House. As this is our first project, we'll be covering a ton of foundational concepts along the way. Let's jump in. So here we are in a new scene, so I'm going to start by saving the project. Controller Command S, and I'll name this Freckles 001. To get started, we're going to look at two different ways to add face effects. Now you don't have to follow along for this part, I'm just going to show two different ways of doing things. In the hierarchy panel, I'm going to right click, go to face effects and add a face mask. Now here you can see on my face it added this kind of colorful image. And over here under opacity, if we turn this all the way to 1, you can see it's totally opaque. You can't see, I guess you can see a little bit of my skin underneath. But if we go in the blending mode from normal to multiply, you see now that darkens it, because multiply is essentially literally multiplying the values of the color texture on top of the video underneath. So it's going to darken. And screen does the opposite, where it lightens. So you can see these lighter portions are a bit brighter. And overlay kind of does a little bit of both. It lightens and darkens. Now, in order to show how the mapping is done on this, I'm going to change the texture from this little default one to actually the default texture here. And now we can see a grid on my face. And if I look right at the camera and open my mouth a little bit, you'll notice the grid is almost perfectly straight across. So you can see that it's mapped basically from the screen forward, or from the camera forward. And if we disable this opacity enable, you'll see this is the entire expanse of this face mask object here. And if I rotate, you can see it's a little chunky, especially around the eyebrows and the sides of the face. It gets a little strange. That's why this opacity mask is nice, because it hides all the irregularities. But you'll notice when looking straight across, all these squares are essentially the same size without much distortion. Now we're going to compare this against a 3D face. I'll disable this face mask, right click, face effects, and 3D face. And this one automatically comes with the checkerboard texture. And now if you look at it, you can see these squares, if I rotate, are still square when they're facing the camera. But as I rotate to the side or back to the front, you'll notice that these are really thin because it's mapping not to this flat image like the face mask was, but it's actually deforming it around to the face. So the 3D face is better when you need to really wrap the texture around the whole face. And the face mask is more useful when doing things that are easier straight on. So if you're drawing some makeup on a texture, this approach will be a little bit easier because you don't have to worry about painting it onto an unwrapped 3D object. Now let's take a look at how we can find some of these assets to paint on. So here we have the 3D face documentation, and you can scroll down and learn more about it. But in our case, we're just going to grab the faceassets.zip. All of these are downloadable files that can help you get started. We're also going to go to the face mask documentation and grab the face mask template.zip. And I'll link both of these pages in the video description below. Now let's open either Affinity Photo or Photoshop, whichever you prefer. I'll be using Affinity Photo for this course. And I'll drag in the Effect House face mask template. Even though this is a .psd file, it still opens in Affinity Photo. I also have two references I want to use. So I'll open up PureRef. And this is a nice little app that makes this floating box where you can add images that you can reference while you're working. So I have two images that I grabbed from Unsplash. I have a good Freckles reference here and a Rosy Cheeks reference here. And I can just drag these right into PureRef, and that way I can see them as I work. Let's start by making the Rosy Cheeks. First, I'm going to disable most of these layers. So I'm just left with the face. Now I'll add a new layer and rename it Blush. You can also call it Rosy Cheeks if you want. Under Brushes, I'm just going to scroll down and grab one of these soft brushes. And out here, if you hit B, that goes to brush mode, and then you can start drawing. To get the color of the cheeks, I'm going to grab this eyedropper, drag it onto the skin, just so we have a base skin tone, and then single click here to enable that. Now I'm just going to darken it, add some saturation, and pull it a little bit closer to red. It kind of matches this skin tone. Now, if you're just using a mouse or trackpad, that's fine, but I highly recommend getting a Wacom and a Wacom pen. That way you can much more easily draw as you go. I also have this sick glove that helps my hand not catch on the Wacom surface. So with our color selected, now we can get painting. I'll hit Command plus to zoom in. And if I start painting right now, you can see it's very strong. It's painting at 100%. So let's turn this down. Under opacity, I'm going to click and drag and set this to a lower number. That way, as I go, it's not going to be so intense. And you can always layer up a second and third layer. And in order to paint both sides at the same time, up here under symmetry, I'm going to tick that on. And then you'll notice this line appears. And so right now, you can see it's painting across, I guess, both of these axes. And that's not what we want. So let's grab this, drag it to the bottom, and hold Shift so it snaps. You can see it snapping kind of awkwardly. So now as we paint one side, the other side paints as well. But you still notice it's painting up here. So I think we need to enable mirror as well. There we go. So now as we paint on one side, the other will mirror it. So now I'm just going to go through the cheek and the nose and just look at this reference and see where these red areas appear. And if you need to change the size of the brush, you can hit open bracket and close bracket, and that will change the size. And you see as I painted here, I accidentally moved this axis. So I'm going to move that back. And then up here, I can lock it. So that way I can't accidentally move this anymore. So now we have a decent base, but it looks a little choppy. There's kind of a warmer spot here, and then it's kind of less intense here. So let's go to this smudge brush over here. Make it a little bit bigger. So with that, I'm just going to slowly massage these areas until it's a lot smoother looking. And as I'm working over here, I can see the effects happen over here as well. And if this doesn't seem to be working, you can adjust the strength. You can really see how strong an effect this can have. It essentially grabs whatever you have and pulls it forever. So having a medium strength is helpful. And if you find you're not getting smooth results, you can go over to the brushes and make sure you have one of these softer brushes selected. That way when I go over this, it tends to smooth it out a little better. So if we go back to our layers and toggle this on and off, you can see the effect it has. And it may feel a little strong, but in Effect House, we can adjust the opacity. So it's okay if this is a little bit stronger than what we'll end up using. So now I'm going to hide this layer. And let's make a new layer and call it Freckles. Now I'll zoom in and let's grab a smaller brush. So under brushes, we still want it to be somewhat soft. So I'm just going to grab this 8 here. And let's see what this looks like. And you can see I still have my smudge brush enabled over here. So if we hit B, that switches it back to our brush mode. Now we can actually paint back on the surface. So with the freckles layer selected and the paintbrush enabled, let's make this a lot smaller. Just do a little spot. You can see it's definitely too large and the color is wrong. So let's make it a bit darker and maybe a little less saturated. So it's more of a brown. And let's make the brush teeny tiny. Almost so it's just 1 or 2 pixels big. So now if we draw just very gently, you can see we're getting some decent dots, but they all look really round and uniform. So I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to make the brush even smaller. Let's try going down to actually just 1 pixel. So you see you have to draw quite a bit more to get those shapes, but you have more control over more non-uniform shapes like this. And now that I have the brush settings set up, I'm going to spend a little bit of time and just cover this part of the face with freckles. And in PureRef, if I middle click and drag, I can move over to this reference. Once you have a solid base, you can disable symmetry and mirror, and then hit E for the eraser, and then erase a few of the freckles close to the symmetry line that make it look very obviously mirrored. And hitting B to go to the brush again, with symmetry still off, we can add a few more details that aren't going to be mirrored. That way it doesn't look so symmetrical. Once you have the freckles in a place that you like, you can turn back on the blush and see how that looks together. And I'll go ahead and hide my puref. Now let's talk about layer order for a second. Right now we have freckles and then blush, and freckles is on top of blush. If we switch these, not much happens because this blush is pretty transparent. But just as an example, I'll create a new layer, make a big brush, and this one I'll make the opacity 100%. And I'll change this to pure white. If I draw on here, you can see it covers up everything. But if I grab this layer and bring it below the freckles, you can see the freckles show through, and if I bring it below the blush shows through. So in most image editors, the top layers are going to be most visible and on top of the layer stack. So now let's export these as images. I'll hide this bottom layer. And now it's kind of hard to see, but you can see the blush and the freckles are still there. And to give us more flexibility, we're going to export the blush and freckles separately. So I'll disable the blush and just export the freckles on its own. In Affinity Photo, I can hit Shift Option Command S, and that'll bring up this export window. Now you see we have different options here. We can export as a PNG, a JPEG, or any of these other formats. In order to demonstrate, I'm going to export a PNG and a JPEG so we can compare the differences. So I'll start with the PNG. And PNGs are nice because they include transparency. So I made a new folder called Textures, and I'm putting Freckles 001 in it. Now I'll do the same and export a JPEG. Now JPEGs don't have any transparency, so now you see there's a white background. And in Affinity Photo, you can change that under matte here. So you can have it be a black matte. And it's kind of hard to see, but the freckles are in there. But we're going to keep it as white. And I'll also name this Freckles 001. This time it'll automatically put the JPEG extension. Now let's do the same for the blush. So now we have blush as a JPEG and blush as a PNG, freckles as a JPEG, and freckles as a PNG. And most of the time when exporting JPEGs and PNGs, the JPEG is going to be smaller because it doesn't have that alpha channel. And JPEGs also use a lot more compression usually. However, in this case, the freckles JPEG is larger than the freckles PNG. So it's not always going to be the case that JPEGs are smaller. Now let's go back into Effect House and apply these textures. I'm going to delete the 3D face that we have and enable the face mask again. Now let's drag in these assets. I'm going to select both the JPEGs and PNGs for these. So with the face mask selected, under texture, I'm going to click this default texture, twirl down this built-in textures folder, and under the textures folder, I'm going to select blush. And you can see these white ones are the JPEGs, and these are the PNGs because they have transparency. So now you can see how all of this is white because that's baked into the JPEG. But for the blush, we're actually going to multiply it. So instead of overlay, we'll select multiply. And now you can see a little bit of fleshness there. If I toggle the face mask on and off, it's easier to see. Now let's compare this against the PNG. So with it still selected, I'll click blush and select the PNG. Now nothing happened, which is what we would expect. But if we go from blend mode multiply and go to normal, you can see it still looks the same. But if we switch back to the JPEG, normal is basically just showing us the image. So now you can really see the difference between this JPEG and this PNG. But I'll keep this as multiply. And if you find that it's too strong, you can just turn down the opacity here. I'll keep it pretty strong for now. Now let's make another face mask for the freckles. Right click, face effects, face mask, and we should name these. So single click and then single click again. Now for the freckles, it added this default texture again. So we're going to switch it down to freckles, and I'm just going to use the PNG for this. And by default, the opacity is set to 0.5. So if we put this all the way up to 1, now you can see it right along my nose and cheeks. You can see as I adjust opacity, it's easier to see where that's happening. Now to test this effect on yourself, click on the Preview in TikTok button, and that will generate a QR code. And from there, you want to long press on the TikTok app icon, and that will pop up a few options. And if you tap Scan, that brings up the TikTok QR code scanner, and then you can scan this QR code and test it on yourself. And there you have it.